Joppa Girls. The message and memories these Joppa girls hope to convey to present and future audiences is the sense of community, warmth, and strong family values that were so important to their childhood years growing up in Joppa. Although Joppa's reputation was perceived to be less respectable than those citizens who lived up along and north of State Street, they are proud to call themselves the Girls of Joppa. Virginia, Ginny Lowell, age 93, lived in Joppa in the 1920s while the trolleys were still in operation. 25 years of memories of social gatherings and customs, right up until the end of World War II, colored Ginny's life until her move to Newbury. Jean Doyle's memories of Joppa are from the years 1929 to 1940. Vivid, early year recollections of Joppa formed the cornerstone of Jean's books on Newburyport history. The first 10 years of her life, in many ways, shaped Jean's lifelong love of Newburyport and its history. Patricia, Patty Sayward, wins the Lifetime Achievement Award as she is now on her 86th year of life in Joppa. Moving a short distance from her family home on Union Street to her own home on Water Street, Patty has had a lifelong love of Joppa and the sea. Recognizing the inevitability of age and health-related issues, the Joppa girls agreed to record their memories. The goal is to make the Joppa of the past come alive as they experienced it over the past 90 years. Through memories, poems, photos, and anecdotes, you will gain a sense of the vitality of the people, the neighborhood, and the sea. Close your eyes as they take you back to the Joppa they recall. Hear the crash of the waves as the water rolls across Water Street. Hear the songs of the clamshuckers as they work tirelessly and now imagine a place they called home. Patty Sayward was unable to attend this recording session. I will be reading on her behalf. My name is Marcia Foley, and I am Jean Doyle's daughter.
I am not a speaker. I enjoy listening. But when I hear tour guides and others who have no knowledge of earlier Joppa say what a terrible place it was, my blood pressure rises. I spent the first 18 years of my life in Joppa. I grew up in the house my grandfather built when he and my grandmother married. My mother was born in that house and lived there her 88 years. It was a happy place to live. All the neighbors were friendly, good people, and you knew the people on the adjoining streets. We were in and out of each other's homes sharing news and goodies. My grandfather owned a grocery store on Upper Purchase Street where I enjoyed going until his retirement. For quite a while, 4 families in my immediate neighborhood got together for supper on Saturday. One baked beans, another donated homemade pickles, and someone else brought homemade bread and so forth. A block up the street was Hicks Bakery with all kinds of tempting pastries. Bismarcks and cream puffs were my favorites. The right-hand counter as you entered was filled with penny candy. Joe Hale across the street had a vegetable garden and sold to the neighborhood. On Madison Street was Goodwin's Fish Market with fresh fish daily. If you had unexpected guests, you could dash to Joe Hale's, Goodwin's, and Hicks and serve a great meal in no time. Mary Thurlow on Neptune Street and Carrie Wall on Madison Street made homemade bread, pies, and cookies to sell. People from all over the city used to come and buy them on Saturday. We once watched as the son of my mother's friend kicked the bread home. My mother called her friend so she could rescue it. Carrie Wall also sold braided rugs. The Emma Andrews Library was open Wednesday and Friday. You entered the children's room from Marlborough Street and the adult room from Purchase Street. The librarians were very good to my mother in her later years and picked out books she would enjoy. 2 librarians, I remember, were Bessie Pramberg and Miss Clancy. The trolley went right by our house, ending a few doors down at the corner of Marlborough and Purchase Streets. Once a year, the open trolley would take the Methodist Sunday School children on a picnic. It looked so festive, and I wanted to join badly, but I was never allowed. I think their destination was Salisbury Beach. The People's United Methodist Church was a big social center at that time. My grandmother was very active and belonged to the Ladies' Aid Society. I got to go on all their outings and parties. The birthday suppers were a big deal. Each member had a table celebrating the month they were born. They really went to a lot of work decorating appropriately and having a special birthday cake for that table. It was interesting to walk among the tables and see how original people were. On the corner of Hancock and Madison Street was an old school that wasn't used. My mother had attended it and my aunt taught there. There were no trespassing signs at the old school, but we used to go in and wander around. It was torn down later and an apartment house was built there. As for juvenile delinquency, I remember lying on the ground by the fence in my friend's yard. The fence had a hole in the bottom and we could reach under and take Concord grapes from the neighbors' vines. We were forbidden to go in that yard, so it was quite daring. Anyone looking could see us. We used to play a lot of street games and make hopscotch games on the sidewalk. I liked to roller skate. My block and Marlborough Street had good cement sidewalks, and I could skate for hours. We had great ice skating at the Newbury Green, Meeting House Pond, Johnson's Pond, and Quill's Pond. We used to slide at March's Hill until our mittens were frozen to our hands. We would go by way of the railroad tracks, starting at Purchase Street. The trains were active then, delivering coal to the waterfront uptown. As the trains approached Purchase Street, a workman would jump out and stop cars and people on the street. We walked to school. The first 6 grades were at Brown School and grades 7 and 8 at Jackman. We came home for lunch. At that time, the noon meal was called dinner and the evening meal was called supper. A store on the way home had a large display of pomegranates for 5 cents each. I wasn't allowed to buy them as my mother thought they weren't good for you. I loved them, probably because I couldn't have them then. They did sell pickled limes, which I enjoyed. When I was in grammar school, my mother used to take a carload of kids somewhere each Saturday in the summer. We often went to Salisbury Beach. There was a funhouse there with a big slide and a barrel that constantly turned. The trick was to stay upright. The Neptunes had a building on Hancock Street. They socialized upstairs and had bowling alleys downstairs. They had an excellent fife and drum corps. When they won a muster, they would have a lively parade, and I loved it. The Unitarian Church built a chapel on the corner of Purchase and Madison Streets. I don't remember how long they had services there, but during the Depression it became a WPA building. There was a large room they used as a dance hall. An instructor came over once a week and taught dancing to all interested. During the week, kids could stop in for board games and socializing. Later on, the Amvets tried to own it, but the neighbors protested, fearing noise and traffic problems. The neighbors won. Eventually, it was converted into a private home. In high school, we lived on our bikes. We'd ride our bikes to school. After school, we'd go to Plum Island. After supper, we'd just ride around until dark. Then we would gather on Wade's porch. We just talked and sang, but it was very enjoyable. Mr. Wade gave us great parties, but I think he enjoyed them as much as we did. On Hancock Street, after crossing the bridge, on the left was a blacksmith shop. His door was usually open, so one could stand outside and watch him. We had ice chests, not refrigerators. Mr. Quill, the iceman, used to go house to house with his horse-drawn ice wagon and sell us the ice. I think we had signs with different prices that we put in the window to tell him what we wanted. The kids ran to the back of the open wagon and took the ice slivers that were made and ate them. I imagine they were pretty germy. When his horses used the street for a bathroom, my mother would go out after they left and sweep up the manure and put it around her flowers. The waterfront from Brontfield Street to Madison Street had no cement wall. It had a railing made of pipe. In a nor'easter, the water and thatch used to really blow across the street. It was fun to drive by in a car with water and thatch landing on the roof and see and feel the waves blowing across Water Street. The comb factory on the corner of Barton and Chestnut Street was open then. I think you could look in the lower windows like you could at the Daily News on N Street. I don't remember when it was torn down, but I remember going to look at the first house built on the property. Next to the corner on Madison and Purchase Street was an old engine house. When the alarm rang, they would bring out horses and hitch up. My mother was always afraid I'd get too near. There were also horses at the back of Hicks Bakery that she thought were pretty wild. After the trolley stopped, we had buses that stopped on many corners. When my husband was in the service, I moved to the house 2 over from where I grew up, and during the war years, these buses were very helpful. At that time, we also had victory gardens in our backyards. When I was in high school, Councilor Simmons cleared a section of land on the river across from his house near Flatiron Point. He brought in loads of sand, and Simmons Beach was born and enjoyed for a long time. Opening day was a big deal. There was a bandstand erected and many activities were planned. All the big wheels were there. One attraction was picking Miss Simmons Beach and Little Miss Simmons Beach. We high school girls paraded around the bandstand while the judges looked us over. Doris Thompson from Washington, D.C., who was visiting her aunt, won Miss Simmons Beach. As I remember, she was really beautiful. Little Miss Simmons Beach was awarded to Jean Wade. Her sister and I took her home to show her parents the award. She looked adorable but cried all the way home. On the upper part of Marlborough Street were tennis courts. The old football field for NHS used to be at the end of South Pond Street. We had games there when I was a freshman. Also, there was a big stable on South Pond Street for horses. We seldom locked our doors. If we did, the key was under the mat or on the shelf. I could walk anywhere in Joppa, day or night, and feel safe. It was a happy place to grow up, and I would never change it for anywhere else.
The first 10 years of my life was spent in a home next to the Emma Andrews Library on Purchase Street in the section of Newburyport called Joppa. Joppa to the natives. It was a unique area composed of native fishermen and recent immigrants that had, through the years, developed a reputation, grossly exaggerated, of being a rough place, and children from other areas were discouraged from going there. Actually, it was a great place in which to live, and some of my fondest memories are of those years. What stands out to me is how much freedom children had then compared to today. We were allowed to play outside with few restrictions. There were lots of children to play with, and when there weren't any, I found other things to occupy my time. For instance, I liked to go down to the bottom of Madison Street, cross the street over to the river, and play by myself in the boats that were at that time lying in the landing. When I was in the 1st and 2nd grades, my sister walked with me to the Immaculate Conception School on Green Street. After that, I was on my own because my friends in the neighborhood went to the Brown School, and my sister's classes were in the new high school on Mount Rural. It was a long walk for a 7-year-old, both morning and afternoon. My father worked as a salesman for Swift & Company. He had a company car, but he was not allowed to take passengers. Everyone went home for dinner, for which we were only allowed an hour. My father, ignoring the restriction, would drive up State Street when we were let out of school, and I'd run up and jump in his car and have a ride home and back at noon. Since I had walked to school, it seemed only natural that I walk to town on Saturday to pay the rent and do other errands. At that time, the rent was paid weekly at a lawyer's office. I also made several trips a week to Wells' store, which was not far away at the foot of Marlborough Street. I carried a little black book in which the owner listed what I had bought and the price. On Saturday, my father would go down and pay the bill. Although very active in her house, her gardens, and with her many siblings, my mother was shy about going out in public. Most of my friends in the neighborhood were a year ahead of me in school, so I was alone the year they entered the 1st grade. Being rather a curious child, I decided to investigate the large barn that belonged to the big white house around the corner on Hancock and Marlborough Streets. I wanted some company, so I enlisted the aid of 2 4-year-old boys. I forget their first names, but their last names were Bean and Estabrook. I was 5 years old at the time and would be entering the first grade in September. When we opened the door of the barn, we saw a bunch of boxes just waiting to be emptied. We unpacked a few that were mostly dishes and had a great time playing tea parties and imagining all kinds of things. When we were finished, we carefully put the dishes back so that no one would know we were there and casually walked out the door. This went on for a few weeks until one day a neighbor saw us and reported us to the owners. The mothers of the two boys were furious, and my mother wasn't very happy either. Today, the mothers would probably be charged with the neglect of their children. The Emma Andrews Library was important to all of us. Living next door gave me easy access to the books, and I learned to read at an early age. What I remember the most, however, is the time I spent upstairs where Mr. and Mrs. Burt Latterby lived along with a friend, Addie Coombs. Mr. Latterby was the caretaker of the library, which I think helped pay his rent. They had no children, and I was only 3 years old when they first welcomed me. I recall the Model T Ford he kept in the yard, puzzles for me to make, and the formal room reserved for a visit from the minister. Most of my time, however, was spent with Addie, who taught me how to embroider and let me play with her jewelry. Everyone is so busy today, it would be hard to find someone today to do the same. It was in those early years that I learned the meaning of death. Both Addie and Bert died while I lived there. Whenever I go by the library, fond memories return of the time and affection they gave me. Now that I am an adult, I can appreciate all that Joseph Hale did as a philanthropist. As a child, however, I thought he was a mean old man who didn't want us playing in his property that bordered on my backyard. In fact, he had complained to my father, which meant I had to obey. My best friend in those years was Janet Knight, who lived a few houses up the street. One winter day we heard that a big storm was coming, and we couldn't resist the temptation to play in the snow. So we plotted to meet early the next day before our families were out of bed. The snow was so deep that we had little trouble getting over the fence that separated our properties from his. We headed for the tool shed that we knew was there. The snow was so deep that we were able to get on top of the roof and had a wonderful time jumping from the top to the snow below. My mother was quite angry with me when I returned home, not because I played in Mr. Hale's yard, but because I was expected to shovel the sidewalk before I left the house. I don't recall any 8-year-old girls being assigned that task today. Janet's family had a cottage at the Knobs on Plum Island, along with relatives like the Haleys and the Batchelors. On many an early summer evening, we would sit on the tailgate as her father drove us in an old station wagon to the island. That would never be allowed today. The road to the Knobs was not paved at all then, so it was a pretty bumpy ride. The Knobs was an area on the riverside close to where the Plum Island and Parker Rivers meet. The cottages were very primitive. No electricity or telephones, and the water had to be pumped in the morning. Janet and I walked often to the marker that was halfway between the Knobs and the center. The dunes were much bigger then, and we loved playing on them. In the 1940s, the federal government planned to take over not only that area, which is now part of the Wildlife Refuge, but a much larger area, including Scotland Road as well. Newbury and Newburyport citizens fought back, and the area was limited to what you see today. Those people at the Knobs could stay until they died, but they could not sell their property nor leave their property to their children. One by one, as the owners died, the cottages were demolished, but Mrs. Haley was a thorn in their side because she lived until her late 90s. In the meantime, family members vacationed at the Knobs using the one remaining cottage. Shortly after her death, a crew appeared on a day the family was there, and before their eyes demolished the cottage. The summer of 1993 brought a sad ending to many happy memories of the Knobs enjoyed by generations. Now nothing remains of what once was a vacation spot for those people who hailed from Joppa. Episodes like this, along with the closure of the beach during the plover season, have left resentments that linger on to this very day regarding the federal government's management of Plum Island. Mr. Simmons was a city councilor for the South End in the 1930s. There was a lot of poverty at that time because of the Great Depression, and he wanted to do something for the children. So he planned an event in the summer to give them a good time. There was a baseball field at what today is Beacon Street, with prizes for the games that boys liked. None of that was shared with girls, however, today, unlike today, when girls have equal rights in sports. Everyone shared in the swimming at the beach, where Councilor Simmons had had the city bring in truckloads of sand. An ice cream truck provided goodies for all. Down by Simmons Beach, there were 2 beauty pageants for the girls, one for the young girls and one for those in their late teens. Most of the girls, big and little, were dressed to the T's, as we would say at that time. My sister, who was 8 years older than I, was supposed to take care of me. On Wednesdays, my mother always played bridge, a game that was extremely popular at the time. Today, most women work, so you don't hear as much about it. Annoyed at having to babysit, my sister didn't bother to change my outfit that consisted of a rather grubby sunsuit in which I had been playing all day. Feeling very sorry for me, the judges awarded the junior prize to me, and I have a picture taken of me with the Miss Simmons Beach banner across my chest. It shows a plump, squinty-eyed child whose only good feature was curls. Believe me, it was awful. My mother was horrified to read the article the next day on the front page of the newspaper. My sister was in deep trouble. Every time that my daughter Marcia thought I was getting out of hand, she threatened to bring that picture to the high school, where I taught for 30 years, and show it to my students. By the time I was 8 years old, we spent a lot of time on our bicycles. Fore Rock and Devil's Den in Newbury were popular rides, as was going to the falls in Byfield in the spring when the alewives were running. No one had to stop and tell their parents where they were going. We were expected to know when to come home. The Great Depression was a difficult time in the 30s. There were so many people out of work and without food. The government helped as much as possible. Food and clothing were provided in commissaries for families in need. Most important was the fact that people shared. It is interesting to note how people differed in the way they gave or received charity. One woman who lived in our neighborhood who needed help would, if eggs were available in the commissary, make egg salad sandwiches and with a smile on her face, take off for a picnic with her children. My father, because he worked for Swift & Company, got a small discount on meat. Every Saturday, he would buy 5 pounds of hamburg and bring it up to one of my uncles who lived on Purchase Street and say that they had some left over at work. My uncle knew it wasn't free, but they both pretended, because a man has his pride and doesn't want charity. My cousin told me a few years ago that was the only meat they had for the whole week, and there were 4 children in the family. Yes, there was poverty and obstacles to overcome, but Jobby had one advantage that no one could take away, and that was the sheer beauty of this part of town. It is only a short walk from High Street to the river, and one has an open view of the water from Bromfield Street almost to Plum Island. On a clear day in the summer, one can watch the sailboats leave the South End Boat Club as they race to see who is the fastest, or watch the beginners learn to sail. Thanks to Joe Hale, we have a beautiful park enjoyed by many, including newlyweds who pose for pictures they will long enjoy. Across the street are benches for those in need of a quiet time. In many ways, the Hardships brought the community together, and Joppa has not only survived, but has moved from the bottom of the list as to where people want to live to near the top. I will always cling to my memories of Joppa, where I spent the first 10 years of my life.
My name's Marcia Foley, and I'm going to read on behalf of Pat McBurney-Sayward. What a pleasure to live in Joppa with the river at my door, to watch the brilliant sunrise along the Joppa shore. The birds you see winging on their way, the scenery how it changes every single day. Sometimes the river looks like the ocean, with white-capped waves abound, lapping against the seawall and on the shore. Who could ask for more? I was born in Joppa at the beginning of the Depression. During that time, many people ran out of food, and everyone would share with them. No one back then locked their doors. If anyone came at supper time, another plate would go on the table. On Mondays, it was wash day. Everyone's clotheslines would be full of sparkling white sheets and clothes. My mama had 9 kids, and I know she worked from dusk to dawn. We grew a huge garden, and the boys in the neighborhood would fish, clam, and hunt for geese, ducks, and pheasants. Some of them would not have had food if they didn't hunt or fish. You just can't imagine the sunrises and sunsets on the Joppa shore, and the full moon coming up over the water was spectacular. The gunning floats were powered by the man in the float. They would scull with oars through a hole in the back of the boat. In the winter, they were painted white, and at other times covered with eelgrass, hence the name sneak floats. But it was never a game. All the birds were used as food for people. Annually, there would be a horrible parade day. People would dress like we do today for Halloween. The house in this picture, taken around 1910, was our family home, owned by my grandfather. My daddy is the boy on the high stroller. He had infantile paralysis and did not walk until he was 6 years old. During the Depression, I remember my grandfather had a knock on the door. A complete stranger was there, and he said someone told him to go see my grandfather, who we called Pa. The man had a wife and kids and needed money for food. Pa gave him $500 with a handshake, and a couple of years later, the man paid it back. Pa had a good job with United Shoe, and I'm sure he helped us through hard times as well. He owned the Victorian house on Union Street where we all lived. My daddy was only making $13 a week working at the WPA sewage project. He was also an electrician and fixed all the sewing machines. Storms down here in Joppa were wild. When Hurricane Bob hit, my husband's boat was dislodged and smashed against the rocks. It was only a 16-foot boat and motor, but he would take the kids out to fish, and in good weather they would learn to swim off of Woodbridge Island, just a little further down from my house. There was no discrimination back in Joppa in those days. The houses, outside, needed a lot of work, but everyone I knew was clean and neat. The kids, black, white, Protestant, Catholic, Jewish, or whatever, played together and respected the little differences the way we were taught. People's Methodist Church was very active back then. We had over 200 kids in the Sunday school. There were bean suppers once a month. Mabel and Effie Foley were 2 great ladies. Both sang like angels in the choir and minstrel shows, and both had large families and worked tirelessly on behalf of People's Church. My mama lost 2 children back then. My sister died of pneumonia at 3 years of age. Back in those days, they did not have antibiotics, and the closest pediatrician was in Boston. My little brother Everett died at age 8, the day before his 8th birthday. He had sneaked a paring knife out of the kitchen drawer and went to Perkins' playground to make bows and arrows with all the other boys. He fell on the paring knife, and it went right through his heart. What a loss. Everyone came to the house, even the gypsies, with condolences. Back then, the funerals were held in your home if you couldn't afford a funeral home. And Everett used to sing and dance. Every Monday, which was trash day, he would go out when the trash men came and sing to them. Things were almost always happy in all of our houses. Of course, there was never enough money, so we would all work for whatever was offered. Mowing lawns, shoveling snow, doing chores for other people, picking strawberries, blueberries, beans, corn, and potatoes at the farm. Many of the Joppa women would shuck clams to supplement their husband's paycheck. Wages were slim back then. We all had a bread man and a milkman in those days. On Friday, my mama would get 25 loaves of bread for the weekend, and our raw milk came in 8-gallon cans from Noyes' ice cream stand. On Sundays, we would invite friends to supper, but it would be grilled cheese or flapjacks or fried dough, and we loved it. After supper, we would go into my grandmother's side of the house. She would play the piano and would sing all the old songs. We had such fun. During the war, Jack Kelleher, then mayor, would have a variety show at City Hall. A lot of Joppa kids would perform in them. All the proceeds were sent to our boys in the service, and my sister and I were in all of the shows. People's Methodist Church had whist parties once a month. They were mostly at my mama's house because she couldn't go out at night with 9 kids. It was a big money maker for the church. It was 50 cents to play. At the whist parties, one night, my brother Malcolm snuck down the stairs, crawled under the table, and bit Edna Sutherland on the leg, but she wasn't hurt. We all thought it was funny. All the ladies would take 2 days to prepare the annual birthday supper. Every table was decorated for the month it represented, with flowers, candles, special cakes, ice cream, and a full turkey dinner. Every ticket was sold. Our annual minstrel show was also a great hit with singers, endmen, dancers, and comedians. The women all made fudge at intermission that they would sell for 10 cents a bag. Ernie Nutting had the most beautiful baritone voice. He was killed during World War II. When my sister and I were 6 and 7, we sang in all the minstrel shows. I can remember sitting on Ernie's knee singing Mammy. He was dressed as a mammy. Ernie Nutting was also a descendant of Wallace Nutting, the famous painter. Charlotte Gould was a teacher at the Brown School. On Beggar's Night, which today is known as Trick or Treat, we would climb her back steps on Marlborough Street, sign our names, and be giving a shiny new penny. We thought that was great. She ran a gift shop on Marlborough Street after she retired, and it was called Silver Pennies. Dot and Lloyd Douglas had a little popcorn wagon. They supplied all the popcorn at the Newburyport High School games, and on Beggar's Night, every kid got a free bag of popcorn. People's Church had the most famous and oldest weather vane in the country. The church sold it to a museum years ago, but Gene Palumbo made a replica. It was just beautiful. We are now in the process of getting the weather vane repaired. Our truant officer, Everett Hilton, rode his bicycle all over town to check on truants. He was always an end man in the minstrel shows, and his favorite song was "Oh, You Beautiful Doll." His wife made the greatest 2-crust lemon pie, and we kiddingly called her Brown Bottom Maud because her bottom crust was always golden brown. 4 High Road Tea Room at the top of Marlborough Street was run by Miss Fisher and Miss Franklin. It was a darling colonial house with beautiful china. Their chicken a la king was to die for. I washed dishes there for 20 cents an hour. Many Joppa girls waited table there. Naughty, naughty, the girls were supposed to share their tips with the owners, but sometimes the tips would end up in the girls' shoes or bras. In the last of May, we all piled into a Graff Brothers truck, and away we'd go to our grandfather's cottage at Plum Island for a season of frolic and fun. In those days, you could ride in the wide open back of a truck. We would fish, swim, and play in the sand. We, my sister Jeannie and I, would set up pins at the bowling alley. We were paid 5 cents a string, and we took our lives in our hands. There was also a roller skating rink, a penny arcade, and flying horses. My little brother Everett, who died at 8 years old, would tease us to put him on the flying horses. He would get sick and ask to go on again. We moved back to Newburyport before Thanksgiving, and we had the best of both worlds, poor in money, but rich in love, friends, and family. The library was one of our favorite places to go. Vivian White was the librarian, and I am not sure, but I think all the people who volunteered at the library did it for free. Diana Lucy was a war bride from England who raised 4 boys on Water Street. Her introduction to Newburyport was via Madeline Lunt's taxi, a never-to-be-forgotten experience. Madeline was part of Newburyport's varied cast of characters who caused much tut-tutting and enjoyment among the townspeople. Although her Joppa neighbors had no clue, Diana Lucy was a member of the British intelligence team known as Bletchley Circle. This team of men and women worked in secrecy during the war years to crack the code that ended World War II. Diana was sworn to not share any of her wartime work stories with anyone and upheld this commitment until the early 1970s, a full 40 years later. 4 girls from Joppa in their early teens went faithfully to city council meetings when the city wanted to close the Emma Andrews Library. They voiced their opinions because they were always using the library. They even wrote a letter to President John F. Kennedy. My daughter received a letter back from him. She also presented Jackie Kennedy with a silk scarf in Newburyport when the couple came to visit the area. She has a picture of Jackie taking the silk scarf from the Old Newbury Hand Tub Association. Ruby and Frank Cousins were Sheriff Frank Cousins' mother and father. Ruby and Frank had always been my neighbors and friends. Ruby's flowers were gorgeous. Frank's vegetable garden was great, and they shared with everyone. Ruby passed away in my arms. I was inside, and I heard Frank calling, "Pat, Pat." Ruby had been doing the gardening, and when she went into the house, Frank knew something was wrong. She laid on the couch, and I was going to do CPR while Frank was on the phone with 911. The ambulance arrived immediately, but it was too late. Frankie, their son, the sheriff, comes just about every week to see all the neighbors. He never forgot his roots. For more than 3 years, a seagull that we named Jonathan Livingston came to the steps at our back door 3 times a day to be fed. He was the delight of the neighborhood. Then one day, he sat in the bird bath and flew off the next day. We never saw him again. I'd like to end with this poem, which is a tribute to my great-grandfather, William Henry Harrison Perkins. In this picture, he is the man in the hat and goatee at Clam Shack number 1. Times passed. In the late 1800s, along the Joppa shore, stood 13 rustic clam shacks with men working before each door. One of these men, with hat and goatee, has a special place in my heart for me. Your great-great-grandfather he would be, who made his living from the Joppa Sea. In his fish wagon he'd go all around town, selling fish to the poor, middle class, and men of renown. With his fisherman's horn sounding aloud, the customers around his fish wagon would crowd. He lived to the ripe old age of 93 in the Union Street house by the Joppa Sea. The days of such thing are since gone past, but through all of history, the tales will last.